Welcome to Nuclear Physics 101. I'm Hellfire Mage, and this is a fission reactor. Now, fission reactors are pretty amazing because they can generate an insane amount of energy, but they are a little bit complicated. So, what we're going to do today is start from the very basics and go all the way until you have a fully functional fission reactor. We're also going to look at this mess, but let's not worry about that now. Let's get on to the fun building stuff first. So you can basically think of the fission reactor as having two parts, the boiler and the turbine. It's not actually a boiler, it's called a fission reactor, but it works the same way in real life as well. It basically heats up water. That water is then going to turn into steam. The steam's going to travel along this pipe and turn the turbine. The turning force of the turbine is going to generate electricity, and then that electricity is going to come out of here and go into whatever machines you need it to power. And because we're not wasteful, we'll then condense that steam down into water and pump that straight back into the reactor, so we should hopefully have a lossless system. It's really not that complicated if you just think of it as heating up water, using that heat to generate electricity, and then cooling down the water again. You just do that in an infinite loop and get a ton of energy. So, let's start with the turbine, because that one is a little bit simpler. Now, a quick disclaimer before we jump into this. Your recipes may be different to mine. It depends entirely on what mod pack you're using. However, the actual components that you need to use will still be the same, so let's just jump straight into building it. So first off, the most important thing is the turbine casing. You're going to use that to build basically the outside structure of the turbine, and then you can replace some of that with reactor glass, like I've done here, so that you can see what's going on the inside. And then you actually need to build the turbine, so you have this turbine rotor, and then you have the turbine fans. Now, each one of these rotors holds two fans, and you can build the turbine as tall as you want. This is quite a small one, but just be aware it gets wider the higher it goes, so eventually you're going to need to increase the size of the square footage of your turbine if you want to build the turbine any higher. So I've removed our turbine here, and we can start building it up from the ground. Now, speaking of the ground, it needs to be made of turbine casings. The whole thing needs to be nice and solid, and then you can just start building it up. Now, I want the inside of mine to be 5 high in terms of rotors, so what we need to do is make this 6 high off the ground, and do that with all of the corners so that it makes a sort of like archway here, and do that with all 4 corners, and we will get a nice little structure. And you should have something that looks like this. Now, grab yourself some reactor glass and stick those in the walls, fill it all out. Now, if you're doing this in survival, you might want to be a little bit more careful than I'm being, but just make sure that you have all of these blocks actually filled in, and then you should be good to go. And there we go. That is all nice and built. Next thing, you're going to want to put some valves. So we need 2 valves, one for the input of the steam and one for the output of the energy. So when we connect all of this up, we can connect it and the steam is going to go into here, but of course it's not fully built, so it's not actually going to work yet. Next up is the actual turbine. So as I said, I wanted the turbine to be 5 high, so you can build that up to 5. Make sure it's in line with the top of the glass. Don't build it in line with the casings, things won't work then. And then add your lovely turbine blades. And as you can see, that fits nice and neatly without clipping into any of the walls. If it does clip into the walls, it will break the turbine. Next, you want to top that off with a rotational complex, and then surround that with your pressure dispersers. Now, a rotational complex is going to be the kind of transition between the turbine blades and the lovely electromagnetic coil, which you can then just stick on the top there. And then your pressure dispersers basically allows you to keep regulating the pressure within it so it doesn't just explode. Now, on top of that, you want to put some saturating condensers. Now, you don't need the saturating condensers to actually get this to work. However, if you want to get the water out of it, then you're going to need the condensers, and the more condensers you have, the more water you can pull out, so the bigger reactor you can actually sustain with it. Then just surround these with your turbine vents, and you're going to need a lot of vents. This one's definitely going to be bottlenecked by the actual number of vents, but you can always replace some of these with vents if you want, or just add some additional vents around, or make the whole thing bigger. It doesn't really matter as long as you have a lot of vents. You're going to be generating way more power than you need anyway. And then finally, just top off the corners here with your turbine casings and cover the entire thing up. Now, you're going to know this is successful when you finally complete it. It should light up, and when you right click it again, it will give you your industrial turbine interface instead of actually just placing a block like it would if something was missing. If yours isn't working, make sure you go back and just double check that you've got everything, and make sure you've closed your door with glass, because that is something that I have done before. Spent an hour figuring out what's going wrong, and it turns out I had not closed the door with the glass. So that is step 1 completed. We have built a turbine. It did not take very long. It was about 3 minutes, and then we got it all up and running. If you want a little bit more information about it, you can just go into the turbine information section inside the actual turbine itself, and it will tell you where your bottlenecks are. Now, this production is pretty abysmal, only 219 kilo FE, not ideal, and we have an insane amount of water output. So what really we want to be looking at doing is replacing some of these condensers with something like vents or coils. First up, let's fix the vent issue. So you can replace these turbine casings with vents as long as they're not part of the very outer shell. If you try and replace one of these, it's just not going to work. So you can do these ones here to make these double high. You can do these ones here, and you can even do these 9 that are on the top here. You can replace those with vents as well if you want to, and that will make it much more efficient. When we look at it already, all we've done is change the amount of vents, still being limited though, kind of crazy, but that's basically doubled our energy output. Now, the coils are still very limiting, so let's go and fix that. Simply add another coil that's adjacent to the one that you've got, and you can do a couple of those, put the vents back in, and then when we look at it, we're actually producing 1.23 mega FE per tick, which is amazing. That's a lot of energy, and all we did is a couple of tweaks to the design, and again we can just fix the ones on the outside as well, and that'll probably increase it even more because vents were the limiting factor. There you go, we are up to 1.5. Sometimes you don't need a bigger turbine, you just need to optimize your turbine a little bit more. I built it a little bit sketchy in the first place just to show you how to improve it, but there you go. Make sure you're experimenting, make sure you're seeing how best to build this. This is probably still not the most efficient way of doing it, but you've got a turbine up and running, and as I say, you're not really going to need that much energy, even for the crazy stuff in the future. So now that we have the turbine all fully built, it is time for us to build the fission reactor. Now, I'm going to break this down, but really important thing to note is that this radioactive barrel is empty. Never, ever break a waste barrel if it has any radiation in. It will do very bad things. You will die over and over. The area will become irradiated. In fact, I'll show you what happens at the end of the video, but just do not do it. Make sure it's empty. If you need to pump it out, just pump it out to a different barrel and then break it. Don't break it while there's anything in. So now that that is all broken down, let's have a look at what we actually need to build it. Now, it is remarkably similar to the turbine stuff. It's just slightly different. So first up, we still need the fusion reactor casing. That still needs to be the floor, exactly the same as the turbine casing. We've got the reactor glass so we can see what's going on inside. And we have the fission reactor ports, which work exactly the same way as the turbine reactor ports. The main difference is these 4 blocks here. We've already spoken about the radioactive waste barrel. Just make sure that you've got at least one, preferably quite a few of them. You've also got a fission reactor logic adapter. Now, we'll cover that towards the end of the video because that's going to be how you're going to set up your safety mechanism to stop your world exploding. And then you also have the fission fuel assembly, that's basically your fuel, and then the control rod assembly that basically controls the fuel. Very simple stuff. And then, of course, you need your fissile fuel. Again, we'll cover this mess that is the fissile fuel a little bit later on. And you also need some water. So you start this one off exactly the same as you did with the turbine, except we're only going to go 5 high on this one. And then we'll do the same here and make our little archway structure in all 4 sides. There we go, all done. Now, same as before, fill this up with reactor glass until it looks something like this. Now the top you can pretty much just fill in with casing, no problems in doing that, and then you have your shell. So now that we have our shell completed, what we need to do is put some inputs and outputs. Now this side, we're going to have our input of fuel on this side, and then our output of nuclear waste on this side. Now currently, these are both set to inputs, so you just need to grab your configurator, shift right click, and that will output your nuclear waste. Now, when we come over to this side, we're going to need an input of coolant and an output of coolant. So the output of coolant is going to be our steam, so we can set that to output coolant, link that into our input for our turbine, which is going to then generate the water at the top. So since the water is coming in at the top, we're going to put one of our inputs in the top, and that's where the water's going to go. So you've got fuel going in and then coming out, and we have coolant going in and then coming out. I like to do it that way just because it keeps each side nice and simple. You can do it in whatever configuration you want. If you want the input coolant on the bottom, that's completely fine as well. Now, of course, if we just fill this up with water now, all we're going to get is a cube of water. So we need to put some fuel rods inside. Now, every fuel rod needs to be capped with a control rod assembly, and I find it much easier to do those first. And if you stack them all up like this, and you have it so it's 3 by 3, that's actually going to run really, really inefficiently because there's less room for the coolant to work, and it's going to increase the temperature, and it's not going to be great. What you want is you want a checkerboard pattern, like just a normal chessboard, and have them touching the diagonals. That means that each one of these has the maximum surface area it can in order to get the fuel and the coolant in contact with each other. Then all you need to do is put in the actual fuel rods themselves. Nice and simple, nothing fancy about this. And now all you need to do is close it up, give it a few seconds, and then you'll see we have a fission reactor fully built. Now there's a couple of things that you need to be aware of. Firstly, coolant tank, that is the water that goes inside, and the fuel tank, that is the fuel. Never, ever, ever let the coolant tank hit empty. Disaster will happen. Make sure that this is always right filled to the top or as close to the top as you can get it. Now, the nuclear waste, just make sure you're pumping that out, and the heated coolant tank, that's going to be taken care of as soon as you put it through to the turbine anyway, so you don't need to worry too much about that. What I would recommend is the second that you build this, make sure you connect an infinite water supply such as a sink or just a ridiculous amount of water and fully fill this right up to the top as high as you possibly can, and make sure that you do not switch this on. If you click activate, bad things will happen. Do not switch it on until everything is up and running. Now, of course, you also want to be dealing with the waste, so make sure that you put a radioactive barrel there and put a pressurized tube going into it. That should automatically start filling this up once you've switched it on. And of course, you also need your fissile fuel. We'll connect this tank up, but what you would be doing is connecting the tank over here up to here and getting the fissile fuel to go straight into your reactor. Your final step is to connect the output to your turbine and also reconnect your turbine across to the input section of the water. Now you can do that at the same time as you've got this infinite water source as well, but this is going to basically make a loop so that this will never ever be empty. You can disconnect the infinite water supply once you've got the turbine up and running. However, I would make sure that you keep it there just for safety purposes. Then you've got a little bit of a failsafe if something does go wrong with the turbine. So yeah, you do not want this to blow up. It will be bad. But that is basically the fission reactor completed. However, you'll notice something if you turn it on now. When we turn it on, it doesn't go up very much in temperature, but it also seems to not be burning very much fuel, 0.1 millibuckets per tick. Now that is the default setting when you first build the reactor, and it's basically a little bit like a safety measure because if things go wrong it'll take a little bit longer to get out of control. But what does that mean in practice? Well, it means that our turbine is actually only producing 2.84 kilo FE per tick, which is basically nothing. And as you can see by looking in here, the turbine is going very, very slowly. However, when we have a look at the actual reactor itself, we can scram it, which is just turning it off normally. And then looking at this, you can see that the maximum we can go up to is 15 millibuckets per tick, or 150 times the speed. Now, if we just set it to 1 millibucket per tick and compare what we were getting in and out, firstly, when we activate it, the temperature goes up higher, the burn rate goes up, and the energy produced goes up significantly. So we're producing 28.55. Now, if we increase that even further and put that up to the 15 millibuckets per tick, then activate that, the temperature shoots up quite a bit. The coolant also dropped because you use more coolant. However, on the other side of it, we're actually producing now 428 kilo FE per tick. Much, much better. Now, of course, you can always produce more energy by building a bigger reactor. The turbine has plenty of space in order to do that. If we have a look at it now, you'll see that it actually is only running at about 300,000 millibuckets per tick of flow rate, so you could run 3 reactors without any problems at all. Or alternatively, just make the reactor bigger. Not too much of a problem if you do it that way. So that is basically fission reactors all completed. What we need to look at now, though, is how to make the fuel and how to build the safety features. Now, this thing here is very daunting. It is basically fully automated, everything will run by itself. However, you need 4 ingredients. The first one is water, nice and easy to get. You then need uranium, again, just smelt down the uranium ore that you get. You need coal, and you need fluorite. As long as you have those 4 things, you should be able to make fissile fuel no problem at all. Now, before we get started, let me show you a little bit of a cheat. What you need to do is you need to be working backwards from fissile fuel and planning everything according to that. So if you look up fissile fuel in JEI, you'll see it goes to isotopic centrifuge, and what you need to create the fissile fuel is uranium hexafluoride. Now, if we come over to our isotopic centrifuge, you'll see it is filled with uranium hexafluoride. And if I actually turn this on, it is going to start producing fissile fuel. Nice and simple. Now, if we go and click the uranium hexafluoride, it will come up and tell you you need to mix hydrofluoric acid and uranium oxide in a chemical infuser. And that is exactly what we've done. Hydrofluoric acid, uranium oxide in a chemical infuser. Now, it's much simpler to see from above that you actually only have 3 lines going into this centrifuge. First off is your uranium line. Very simple, makes yellow uranium cake and then goes into the chemical infuser. The second one is your sulfur trioxide line. Now that's where your coal gets turned into all of the different components, mixes with the oxygen, and goes into this chemical infuser here as well. And then your final one is the water vapor line, where you just split the water into water vapor, and then those 2 lines fuse together to go and make sulfuric acid and then hydrofluoric acid. So you've basically got 1 line at the top and then a twin prong line at the bottom in order to make the one final output of the fissile fuel. As I say, it can be very confusing to start with, but just take it one step at a line, build your uranium line, and then everything else should fall into place. Just make sure you're working backwards from the fissile fuel all the way back to coal, uranium, water, and fluoride. But once the process is all done, you'll have this lovely fissile fuel that you can then just go and pump straight into your reactor, and that will get it all up and running. 0 problems at all. See? Not that confusing after all, and you can make this a little bit more efficient, but I've tried to keep it sort of as minimal as I possibly can just to help you guys out. Okay, now the thing that you're all waiting for, the safety features and what happens when things go wrong. Okay, so welcome to Hell's Janky Redstone Part 1. There is no Part 2, it just sounds better with the Part 1. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to get you out of a little bit of a bind if your reactor is about to blow up. So first thing, we have 3 of these logic adapters, and they are set to 3 warnings: high temperature, excess waste, and insufficient fuel. You don't need damage critical, purely because if you have damage critical, you're going to have one of these other 3 at the same time. You can put it in if you want, you don't have to. So what will happen is when one of those warnings goes off, it'll emit a redstone signal. And what we want to happen is this logic adapter that we set to activation, we want that to no longer have a redstone signal when these go off. So first off, we set a redstone signal going. Easiest way to do that is just to have a redstone torch going into some blocks, and then this is constantly running. We have no major issues here, there's no problems going on, so it'll run completely fine. Now that will change if we get rid of the coolant line, and you'll see this coolant will start dropping very quickly. Now what I'm going to do is remove this piston and show you what happens if we just trigger it and switch off the reactor when it's at high temperatures. So this should trigger any moment now. Once this temperature starts going up, this should push, and there you go, it's switched off. However, the temperature is still high, it is slowly dropping, but the damage is still going up, and we need an emergency injection of coolant. So what we need to do is reconnect this coolant line, and then everything will be fine, everything will go back to normal. However, we don't want to come back and have to do that every single time, so what we're going to do is create an equal and opposite one, following Newton's laws, on the other side for the coolant. Now, one thing you need to know for this is that if you just right click with your configurator on a pipe, it becomes redstone sensitive. So you want this bottom pipe redstone sensitive and attached to some sort of water, coolant, whatever you're using, and then have this exact same system that we've got this side with the torch and the blocks, but have it connected to the coolant system. So this will not run while there's a redstone signal going. So if we then go and disconnect this pipe, what's going to happen is this is going to drain very, very quickly. The temperature is going to spike, and then when it does, it will trigger both, and it will flood the reactor with coolant, and you have a nice cool temperature, and the damage is actually decreasing quite rapidly. So there you go. It's not the most elegant solution, but it works, and you can reset it quite easily. You can either put a piston the other side and then just redo it, or nice and simply, you can just break it and then put these back, and then the reactor will just start up again. Of course, you can always just hit scram and it will just stop by itself. So that is how you're going to protect yourself from explosions and how to make everything nice and safe. But what happens if it's not safe? What happens if it explodes? Well, let's give it a look, shall we? All we need to do is break this redstone, turn this on, watch the temperature skyrocket, and now all we need to do is say goodbye to our helper bot and watch what happens when this lovely thing overheats. Well, I've been Hellfire Mage. Thanks very much for watching the guide, everyone, and hopefully we won't die a horrible and painful death from nuclear radiation, although that seems very likely. Bye!